So you remember when we talked about realism the other day, and we basically said, here's the foundations. That's great. And then we said this one little tweak about the security dilemma, about power, how power is viewed, actually splits realism into two very different types of realism: offensive realism, defensive realism. And there's a lot of disagreements between them. In fact, there's probably more disagreements between offensive realism and defensive realism than between realism and liberalism to a certain extent. Great. We're going to find the same thing's true here, is that, okay, based on what we just talked about there, if that's sort of the underlying foundations of the theory, what we're going to find out is that human nature and progress, there's really two big views on it. There are more ways of talking about this, but I'm going to sort of simplify it by looking at how Thomas Paine talked about it and how Immanuel Kant talked about it. Both writing about the same time. I think Thomas Paine was in the 1770s, and Immanuel Kant's probably in the 1780s or 90s, right in the same era there. Both liberals, and they both have a very different view about how this actually works, which actually creates a big split in liberalism. So let's talk about this. Thomas Paine. You might remember Thomas Paine from things like Common Sense in 1776. He was this revolutionary over here in the United States, and he said, look, screw England, screw tyranny, we need to be free. So he basically does the story this way. Human nature is, if you want to know what human nature is, it's reason and goodness. Okay, well then, how come people make stupid mistakes all the time? How come people do that? It's because you have things out there that are keeping you from being able to use your reason. And here's the deal. If you remove those obstacles, reason springs up. Get rid of those obstacles and reason. So he's talking, let me just give you what he was talking about. He was saying, if England leaves the Americas are going to be just fine. They're going to figure that they're going to know how to do this. They're going to be, now that they're free, they will set up a government and run a free government, and everything will be fine. So just boot them out. Immanuel Kant is going to look at this a little bit different. Human nature is made up of reason and goodness. Love that. And again, by goodness essentially means that progress there, eventually. But it's not like an overnight thing. He's going to say proper education and time is needed for reason to be effectively used. That's the way he's going to phrase it. So this often gets talked about in terms of think about slavery. Okay, so imagine a society that has slaves. And one day, the society changes the laws and says no more slaves. Okay, so think about the person who is born and raised a slave. And now today, they are free. So what is sort of what's happening now for them? Like, are they, in the Thomas Paine view, now free, and reason springs up, everything's cool, they can sort of figure this out. And I don't mean that they're not using reason, I just mean that now that they're free, they can sort of figure out their life ahead, everything's fine. Or is it like this with Immanuel Kant, that now that they're free, they still need education. They still need a whole lot of, I guess you could say, training in how to be free. I know that sounds kind of jerky right there, but the idea is that reason isn't just something that you naturally have the ability to use. It's something that you learn, and as opposed to something that just is. Now you might say, okay, great. It's not 1700s anymore. Why are we having this conversation? Here's why. We'll just look at a few examples about why those two ways of thinking about it sort of split. So here's an example of one conversation we might have about this. Voters who use reason will tend to vote for peace. This is going to be something that liberals are going to say, is that if you give people the right to vote, democracy, people don't want war because they have to pay for it. They're the ones that are going to get killed. I get why a king would want war, because the king can just tax everybody, gets all the glory from it, and he's not the guy out there fighting. So, but why would the people? The people will vote for peace if they're given the vote. So voters who use reason will tend to vote for peace, not war. So then the question goes, if that's true, who then should have the right to vote? And according to Thomas Paine, based on what we just said about that, here, who should have the right to vote? And the answer is Everybody. Everybody in democracy should be free, and so everyone should be able to use their reason. They have the use of their reason just because, so they should be able to vote. And Kant says only active citizens, meaning only those who have been trained in how to use their reason, are ready to vote. So, for example, kids shouldn't have the right to vote because kids don't know how to use their freedom. What about people who are felons? Felons probably shouldn't get the right to vote because obviously they clearly use their reason to break the law, which shows they don't know how to use their reason. So until they learn how to use their reason in what we call rehabilitation in prison, then they're not ready to go. And of course, this is also going to be fairly important as a way of keeping, for example, in the 1700s, 1800s, women from having the right to vote. Women clearly can't use their reason. They're women. They are emotional. They're not reasoned. So maybe they can be trained into this, but they're not ready just yet. Or maybe ethnic minorities might be another example of that. So it can be a little jerky. It's very what we call paternalistic in that sense. Okay. That doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It's wrong in how it's been applied, perhaps, but maybe it's not. Maybe there does need to be these trainings. And let me explain another example here. Why that's useful. Should we use military intervention to spread democracy? So let's say that the United States, and you're going to watch a video here in a second of George W. Bush. Let's say that it's 2003 and Iraq is not a democracy. Should the United States use military intervention to transform Iraq from a dictatorship into a democracy? And what would Paine say? Paine would say, absolutely. If you come into a place where you see people being held as slaves, then isn't your instinct, isn't the right thing to do whatever you can to release them and set them free, even violence? And Paine would say, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, very effective means. Topple the government. The people will embrace reason. Patience is not a virtue when rights are denied. Again, that sounds really good. A person who's going to talk about this in 2003 with the Iraq War was Vice President Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney said, look, we're going to go in there. We're going to send our troops in there. We're going to take out Saddam Hussein. And we're going to allow the people to become a democracy because now they're free. We're going to free them so they become a democracy. And they will greet us as liberators. They will, throw us parades because we are coming into Iraq to free them. That's not what happened. So this is another one of those things where it sounds right. Everything I said here sounds right. If I come upon a place that's the people are being held as slaves, yeah, I'm going to use everything I can to release them. It all sounds right. But then we look at what happens after Iraq and we find that democracy didn't take root. We weren't greeted as liberators. That what sounds right in theory may not be true, which leads us to Kant. Kant's going to say no. Don't use military. That doesn't mean he'd like to have Iraq be a democracy. He just means military intervention may not be the right thing to do. You're essentially setting them free, but they don't have the tools to be free. Something that we would call, again, in political science speech, civil society. They don't have any training, they don't have any practice or experience in being free, how to govern themselves. And so all you're doing is setting them up to fall back into the same situation of dictatorship or worse, chaos and violence, civil war, things like that, which actually did sort of happen in Iraq. So you say, man, this sounds right, but practically speaking, maybe this is right. And so you see how you get this sort of split. These are very different things. I mean, they're both liberals. Both of the answers here are liberal, but they're very different answers on whether you should use, for example, military intervention in this position or not. One more thing that I want to just add before we move on, and that's modernization. Modernization is a weird word. It's one of those words that covers a whole lot of things. But it's one of those things that if I say liberalism, you might say modernization because it does kind of cover some of the things that we're talking about. The process of modernization is essentially that progress that we're talking about. We kind of lump a few things into modernization, like, for example, progress or technology, or maybe I should say better technology, But it's also going to be things like cooperation and peace and all these good things in the liberal theory. All this is a bunch of good things over here: peace, democracy, better trade, wealth. All that stuff is down here. In the same way that you think that about your own self. Like you're not getting an education and trying to quote unquote better yourself because you think that's going to lead to bad things. You think it's going to lead to good things. In fact, without this sort of education, this experience, you're not going to get to those good things. And it's the same thing here. So essentially what that's kind of called is modernization. It increases areas of cooperation. So the more we move this way, the more cooperation in more areas. Like maybe we cooperated on trade, and now we cooperate on other areas. A term that you read in the readings is this idea of complex interdependence or networks. Is that, okay, the best way I can explain it is this. So let's say you go on a date with somebody. It's your first date, and great. And the date's over. It went all right. How many connections do you guys have together, you and this other person? Like, how many connections are there? There's a couple. Like you've shared a few moments, and you probably have exchanged phone numbers and maybe maybe email addresses, but you probably don't know where this person lives on a first date. You don't know too much about. You might not know their middle name. You don't know their friends, things like that. After 3 months, you would expect there to be more interaction. And after, say, 10 years of marriage, you would expect there be so many places of interdependence. And that's what I mean by complex interdependence. Is it's not just that cooperation is cooperation, but cooperation will always lead to more cooperation and the need for more cooperation and on and on and on. That essentially it becomes a spiral, I guess you could say. It's not just that thing. And that's what I mean by complex interdependence, is the more that we are connected, the more that states interact and have to interact with each other, the more they have to interact with each other. And that's going to keep on going. Eventually, cooperation will crowd out competition. It just becomes too difficult to compete. Cooperation is going to be a thing. And we're going to talk about that here in the last video I'm going to show you, but we'll get to that in just a second. Just hold that thought for now. All it's just basically saying is, it doesn't mean that you're not still a competitive person. You can still be competitive. You can still want things that the other person doesn't want. It's just that to get the things you want, you are now so interconnected with the people around you that you can't not cooperate and still achieve the goals you want to have. Like, I get it. You could move out to the woods and just break off all contacts with other people around you, but would you be able to achieve the goals that you want to achieve? People grow exhausted of violence and suffering is one reason why this is going to happen. And again, what I mean here is the people do. They don't want to fight anymore. They just say, if you give me the vote, democracy, I'm going to say no. I'm figure out a way to solve this without making it painful economically, physically, etc. Increased trade. The more trade we have, the more trade that will come, and you'll get these increased benefits of trade, which makes it really expensive to not trade anymore. Let me just talk about this for a second, this increased trade bit, because that's relatively important. So let's say, is the United States going to fight a war with China? Okay, so what are the costs of a war with China? Well, it's going to be, they have to move the troops out there, they have to, pay the soldiers, all that kind of stuff. It's going to be all the bullets flying around, the destruction, et cetera, et cetera. So war itself would be expensive. But on the very first day of the war, all the trade between the United States and China stops. So think about all the money that's being made from that trade that just immediately goes away. So before you've ever fired a bullet, this war is incredibly expensive, which means that you have more of an incentive to figure out a way to peace the more trade is happening. And so any violence just becomes way too costly. There's cheaper ways to solve your problems than to fight a war. War is still an option. It's a dumb option. And war ends up becoming obsolete. And so you saw that with the You saw that with the reading from Immanuel Kant about perpetual peace. That essentially, as more countries become democracies, there'll be more and more peace, till eventually you reach a point here where there's just no good reasons for war anymore. And then you get perpetual peace. All right, I'm going to have you watch that video from George W. Bush. I want you to listen to his words. Remember, this is back in 2003, right before we went into Iraq and basically removed Saddam Hussein. And so what's the argument behind it? And can you see the liberal